Let me tell you something quietly unsettling about people who set boundaries without apology. We live in a world that celebrates availability, being there for everyone, saying yes, staying flexible, accommodating others even when it costs you. We're told that good people bend, that loving people give endlessly, that strong people can handle anything thrown at them. Yet some people do the opposite. They say no without elaborate explanations. They leave gatherings when they're ready, not when it's polite. They don't respond to every text immediately or at all. They remove themselves from situations that don't serve them, and they do it without performing guilt or crafting justifications for why they're choosing themselves. You might know someone like that. Maybe you are someone like that. And if you are, maybe you've wondered, am I being too harsh? Am I selfish for having limits? Why do I feel guilty for protecting myself when I know it's necessary? Or maybe you're watching someone set boundaries with you right now, and you're wondering, did I do something wrong? Are they rejecting me? Should I be hurt by this? Or maybe you're considering setting your first real boundary, and you're terrified. What if people leave? What if they call me selfish? What if I lose everyone? Here's the question that always lingers. Why? Why does setting a boundary feel like committing a crime? Why do people who protect their peace get labeled as difficult, cold, or selfish? And more importantly, what if boundaries aren't walls that keep people out, but gates that let the right people in? It's easy to assume people who set boundaries are selfish, controlling, or unwilling to compromise, that they lack empathy or don't care about others, that they're building walls instead of bridges, choosing isolation over connection. But that's not the full picture. Beneath the surface, there's an entire psychology at play, one that speaks volumes about self-respect, emotional intelligence, and the quiet courage it takes to disappoint people who expect unlimited access to you. See, for some people, setting boundaries isn't about control. It's about clarity. It's about recognizing that every yes to something that drains you is a no to something that could fill you. It's the understanding that you can't pour from an empty cup, and pretending you can only leads to resentment dressed up as martyrdom. Because whether we admit it or not, modern culture has created an unspoken rule. You owe people your time. You owe them availability. You owe them yes, even when everything in you is screaming no. It rewards those who stay flexible. It praises endless accommodation. And yet, those who set clear boundaries are often the ones who understand love most deeply. They know that real care doesn't mean tolerating everything. It means protecting your capacity to care without resentment. Psychologists have found something fascinating. People who set and maintain healthy boundaries tend to score higher on measures of self-authorship, emotional intelligence, and life satisfaction. They have stronger relationships, not weaker ones. They experience less burnout, less anxiety, and significantly less resentment. In other words, they aren't being selfish, they're being sustainable. And in a world that romanticizes burnout and celebrates people-pleasing, that's radical. Because let's be honest, most people don't set boundaries. They accumulate resentments. They say yes when they mean no, and then quietly blame others for asking. They mistake boundary setting for meanness, when really it's just honesty about what they can handle. But when you set a boundary clearly, something shifts. You stop teaching people that your limits are negotiable. You stop performing availability for people who confuse access with intimacy. You start recognizing that the anger someone feels at your boundary often reveals where they expected to take more than you could give. And that's the secret psychology behind many people who set boundaries. They've learned that resentment is just a deferred boundary, that every time they ignored their own limits to keep someone else comfortable, they paid for it later in exhaustion, frustration, or quiet bitterness they couldn't name. For some, the decision to start setting boundaries comes after years of people-pleasing. Maybe they spent their whole life prioritizing everyone else's comfort over their own, being the reliable one, The one who always said yes. The one who stretched until they broke, and even then apologized for not stretching further, until one day something snapped. Not in anger, but in clarity. They realized that being endlessly available wasn't love. It was a performance, a way of earning belonging they thought they had to buy with their depletion. So they stopped. No dramatic announcement, just a quiet recalibration. A no here, a boundary there. And suddenly, the people who loved their yes had a problem with their no. But here's what's often misunderstood about people who set boundaries. They're not doing it to punish anyone. They're not trying to control or manipulate. They're simply refusing to participate in dynamics that require them to abandon themselves. And in a culture that equates self-sacrifice with virtue, that refusal feels like betrayal to people who benefited from their absence of limits. There's a concept in psychology called differentiation. The ability to maintain your sense of self while in close relationship with others. To be connected without being consumed. To care without losing yourself in the caring. When boundaries are clear, relationships stop being transactions where one person gives and the other takes. They become spaces where both people show up whole, with their limits honored instead of tested. And that's where many people misunderstand what boundaries actually are. They think a boundary is a rejection, a shutting out, a way of saying you don't matter. But a boundary is an invitation. It's saying, this is how you can love me in a way I can receive. This is what I can give without resentment. This is where I end and you begin. The people who respect that invitation, they stay, they adjust, they appreciate the clarity because it means they know how to love you correctly. The people who fight it, they reveal something important, that they were more comfortable with your overextension than your honesty. Think about it like this. When someone sets a boundary and you feel anger, that anger is information. It's showing you where you expected more than they could sustainably give, where you mistook their pattern of yes for an obligation to never say no. And that's not manipulation on their part. That's just the truth of human capacity finally being spoken aloud. Now, if you're the one watching someone set a boundary with you, here's what you need to know. Their boundary might not be about something you did wrong. It might just be about what they need. But if they're setting a boundary specifically with you, the honest question to ask yourself is, have I been taking more than they could give? Have I been treating their yes as guaranteed? The answer isn't always comfortable. But their boundary is information, not punishment. And how you respond to it will tell them everything they need to know about whether you can stay close. Of course, not everyone who sets boundaries is doing it from a place of health. Some people use boundaries as weapons, as ways to control, punish, or manipulate. They confuse boundaries with walls so high no one can reach them, even when connection is offered with respect. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about people who set boundaries because the alternative is resentment, who say no because their yes has to mean something, who protect their energy because they've learned that depletion helps no one. There's a deep truth beneath that clarity. In a world that constantly says accommodate everyone, choosing to honor your limits becomes a form of self-preservation. It's saying, I exist beyond your expectations. Not everything I experience is meant to be available to you. Some of the most honest relationships are built on clear boundaries. Not because the people in them are cold or withholding, but because they're committed to showing up without resentment. They'd rather disappoint you with honesty than please you with a yes that breeds bitterness. This is where the paradox lives. We're told that love means never saying no. Yet sometimes saying no is the most loving thing you can do. For yourself and for the relationship. When you set a boundary, you stop pretending you're infinite. You stop teaching people that your limits don't matter. You begin noticing which relationships were built on your overextension and which were built on mutual respect. That kind of clarity, raw and sometimes uncomfortable, feels truer than any people-pleasing ever could. And the people who set boundaries consistently, they live in that clarity. They make choices that don't need everyone's approval. They honor their limits without turning them into apologies. and they let relationships adjust or end based on whether the other person can respect what they need. Part of this is about self-authorship. Knowing who you are and what you can handle, even when nobody understands your choices. When you're grounded in that knowing, you don't need others to validate your boundaries. You don't need permission to protect your peace. That's not arrogance, that's integrity. And ironically, the same people who set firm boundaries often have the deepest capacity for connection because they're not performing availability out of fear. They're choosing presence from a place of fullness. And that fullness only exists because they've learned to say no to what depletes them. But they save that full presence for relationships where it's met with respect. Not for everyone who demands access. Because real intimacy isn't measured in how much you tolerate, it's measured in how honestly you can show up. These are the people who understand that boundaries aren't about keeping everyone at a distance. They're about letting the right people come close in ways that don't require you to disappear. They don't need the world to understand why they left early, why they didn't answer, why they said no. They just need to honor that the decision was right for them. And maybe, just maybe, in a world desperate to make everyone comfortable, their boundaries aren't coldness. They're wisdom. A reminder that you can't love anyone well if you're running on empty. That sometimes the most generous thing you can do is refuse to give what you don't have. You know what's fascinating? The longer someone maintains clear boundaries, the more peace replaces guilt. In the beginning, every no feels like a small betrayal. There's anxiety, fear that people will leave, worry that you're being unreasonable. But over time, something changes. The guilt fades. The friendships that required your self-abandonment fall away. And what's left are relationships where your no is respected as much as your yes. Where your limits aren't seen as obstacles, but as information about how to love you well. Distance becomes clarity. Boundaries become freedom. And the space you create by saying no gets filled with things that actually matter. It's as if protecting yourself finally allows you to stop performing an endless yes and start living from what's actually true. Because when you're no longer managing everyone's feelings about your limits, you start existing from your center instead of your edges. There's a quiet beauty in saying no and meaning it. You're not defending your boundaries. You're not justifying your capacity. You're just there, clear about what works for you and what doesn't. Trusting that the people who matter will respect that. And that's something endless availability never allows. But the psychology behind this goes deeper than preference. It's rooted in how we process self-worth. Every time we ignore our limits to keep someone else comfortable, we're unconsciously teaching ourselves that other people's needs matter more than our own, that our discomfort is an acceptable price for their approval. Over time, we begin to believe we don't deserve limits. We start thinking that good people give endlessly. And if we can't, we're failing. Now, imagine someone who resists that programming, someone who deliberately chooses to honor their limits without consensus, who says, this is what I can give, and this is where I stop, and that's not up for negotiation. That's not selfishness. That's self-respect. It takes profound clarity to set a boundary without needing anyone to agree it's reasonable. People who do this often have what psychologists call a strong internal locus of evaluation. Their sense of rightness comes from within, not from whether others approve. And here's what's even more interesting. Research on relational health shows that relationships with clear boundaries are more intimate, more trusting, and more satisfying than relationships built on unlimited access. Because when your yes means something, people trust it. When your no is honored, intimacy deepens. You're no longer wondering if someone loves the real you or just the version that never says no. And maybe that's the real freedom. Not needing to perform endlessness to be worthy of love. But boundaries don't always feel clean. Sometimes they cost you people. Not because you're wrong, but because those people were attached to a version of you that never said no. They liked your availability, your flexibility, your willingness to bend until you broke. And when you stop, they call it selfishness. But real selfishness looks different. Real selfishness is demanding someone abandon their limits for your comfort. Real selfishness is punishing someone for honoring what they can handle. Real selfishness is expecting people to stay depleted so you never have to adjust. Setting a boundary isn't selfish, it's survival. And maybe some people can't see that. Maybe they'll interpret your no as rejection, your limits as coldness, your self-preservation as cruelty. But that misunderstanding doesn't make your boundary wrong. It just means they were more invested in who you were to them than who you actually are. Of course, losing people still hurts, even when the boundary is necessary. Even when you know staying would have meant losing yourself. There's grief in watching relationships end because someone couldn't respect your limits. But with time, you start noticing something beautiful. The people who stay, who adjust, who honor your boundaries without resentment, those relationships deepen. They become spaces where you don't have to choose between connection and self-respect. And maybe that's what boundaries actually create. Not distance, but the possibility of real closeness. So the next time someone sets a boundary with you, don't assume they're pushing you away. Maybe they're inviting you closer, just in a way that doesn't require them to disappear. Maybe they're not being difficult. Maybe they're being clear. Maybe they're not selfish. Maybe they're just done being selfless in ways that breed resentment. And maybe, just maybe, their boundary isn't rejection, it's trust. The quiet belief that if you care about them, you'll respect what they need. That love doesn't require limitless access. That real connection can exist within boundaries, not despite them. Because in the end, we're not meant to say yes to everything just because someone asked. We're not meant to accommodate everyone at the cost of ourselves. We're not meant to perform endless availability to prove we're worthy of love. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is say no. Not because you don't care, but because you care enough about the relationship to show up without resentment. And the people who set boundaries, they remind us of that. With every clear no, every honored limit, every moment they choose themselves without apology. They remind us that boundaries aren't walls. They're the foundation of every honest relationship. Sometimes love means saying this far and no further. And that's not where connection ends. That's where it finally becomes